In 1990, Miami's property market surge represented a treasure hunt for certain individuals and catastrophe for others. $2 million disappeared into a network of fictitious real estate transactions, and the pair responsible appeared to vanish completely. For years, the investigation remained inactive, stored in forgotten archives. Subsequently, in 2021, a solitary satellite photograph exposed something unbelievable: an expansive estate missing from all governmental documentation, concealed beneath multiple corporate ownership structures. What nobody realized at that moment was that discovering its actual proprietor would resurrect one of Miami's most mysterious financial crime cases. During early 1990, Miami throbbed with the energy of a flourishing building industry. The cityscape expanded vertically monthly, and the metropolitan periphery underwent transformation at an almost supernatural rate. In areas that had consisted of barren fields mere months previously, concrete foundations were being laid for housing developments, business complexes, and extensive retail centers. Regional publications saturated their property sections with striking headlines guaranteeing rapid profits, while radio advertisements encouraged audiences to purchase immediately before values increased twofold. The atmosphere consisted of hope, investment speculation, and the conviction that anybody could become wealthy by obtaining the correct land parcel. Within this energized environment, Terrence and Yvette Johnson seemed to represent the type of business-minded couple who understood how to capitalize on opportunities. Terrence demonstrated natural charisma, the kind that could rapidly eliminate doubt and transform interest into confidence. He communicated with assurance, creating stories of market expansion and assured value increases. Yvette functioned with silent effectiveness behind the scenes, organizing documentation, generating contracts, and delivering sharp, professional-appearing papers at precisely the appropriate moment to comfort uncertain purchasers. Combined, they displayed the appearance of trustworthiness. They established a property sales business with Florida State and leased a modest yet respectable office in Miami's commercial area. To prospective clients, their enterprise appeared authentic from all perspectives. They bought classified advertisements in respected newspapers, employed a photographer to document overhead shots of development areas, and created refined marketing materials containing photographs of well-maintained roads and conceptual renderings of upcoming residential projects. The advertisement terminology was crafted to create urgency. Expressions like exclusive chance and restricted availability were combined with polished imagery of planned communities. When potential purchasers arrived, they experienced a demonstration that appeared both professional and comprehensive. The office surfaces displayed enlarged property maps with marked sections identified as obtainable. On the meeting table, there existed model parcels and printed development plans displaying recreational areas, educational institutions, and commercial centers that were currently in authorization phases. Terrence discussed premium locations and approaching infrastructure. Yvette supplied prepared purchase contracts neatly organized with payment directions and deed copies that contained official stamps and signatures identical to those produced by the county recorder's office. For individuals seeking additional verification, she generated certified-appearing land surveys and construction permits that seemed authentic in all aspects. However, everything was constructed. Numerous parcels they marketed either belonged to current proprietors or had never been divided into the sections represented in the paperwork. The official seals were fake. The signatures were falsified to match those of genuine municipal workers. Several cadastral maps were incomplete copies from obsolete records, manually modified to establish non-existent properties. The complete operation was a complex deception designed to endure just sufficiently to gather substantial monetary amounts. During the initial 6 months exclusively, the Johnsons succeeded in marketing these imaginary plots to multiple investors, obtaining approximately $2 million. The funds arrived through bank drafts, electronic transfers, and occasionally currency, all placed into the company's primary account. Subsequently, the money was rapidly divided into numerous transactions, some directed to additional U.S. financial institutions under business names, others transferred internationally. This stratification made following the capital exceptionally challenging. By middle 1990, initial indicators of problems surfaced. Investors who anticipated receiving legitimate property documentation encountered inexplicable postponements. Weeks became months, and questions regarding development advancement received ambiguous responses about administrative delays. Actually, no construction was scheduled, and no authorizations were legitimate. Grievances started reaching Miami law enforcement. When detectives visited the company's registered office, they discovered an unoccupied location. The furnishings had disappeared, telephone service terminated, and the remaining documents proved useless, collections of fraudulent paperwork with no valid legal authority. The connection to the Johnsons was already diminishing. Police questioned multiple individuals who had served as the couple's sales representatives. These agents claimed they were ignorant of the deception. They had also been presented with persuasive materials, instructed to demonstrate them to customers, and compensated with fees for each transaction. From their viewpoint, they had been authentic employees of an authentic enterprise. Detectives explored various possibilities. One investigation suggested potential participation of dishonest employees within the county property registration office. Certain witness testimonies indicated that official seals and signatures had been verified through methods that would have demanded internal assistance. Nevertheless, without solid evidence of corruption or conspiracy, this theory failed. The financial examination disclosed a partial connection leading to Mexico. Specific bank transactions from the company's accounts had been sent to Mexican establishments, and travel documentation showed airline reservations purchased under Terrence and Yvette Johnson's names for destinations to Mexico City. However, immigration documentation showed they had never actually entered the country. It became progressively evident that these actions were intentional misdirection, intended to persuade investigators that the couple had escaped internationally. By late 1991, the investigation had declined in intensity. With no verified location for the suspects, no recent information, and restricted authority to pursue evidence internationally, detectives encountered an impasse. In 1992, the investigation was officially terminated and categorized as unresolved. The documents were stored in extended archives, their significance apparently concluded. Ultimately, the Johnsons had succeeded in disappearing, not merely physically but legally. Without international agreements to utilize, and with no current observations, law enforcement possessed minimal expectation of recovery. The taken funds remained untraced, distributed in unknown accounts, and transformed into holdings that would be practically impossible to locate without fresh evidence. The documentation joined thousands of additional inactive investigations in the records, marked, dated, and stored for the victims. It represented a harsh conclusion without compensation, without detentions, and without the fulfillment of witnessing those responsible confronting justice. By 2021, Miami had changed beyond identification, where vacant parcels once extended toward the skyline in the early 1990s. There were currently crowded communities, maintained recreational areas, and sprawling business districts. The previously semi-agricultural region of Palmetto Bay had developed into an exclusive residential neighborhood characterized by secured communities, landscape streets, and properties valued in millions. Construction there was rigorously controlled. New building demanded authorizations, examinations, and complete registration in governmental land documentation. Within weeks of construction commencement, projects emerged on county property charts and taxation records, the information recorded in the public database of the Miami-Dade property assessor. Jamal Harris, a 38-year-old geographic analyst, had been employed for years at a private organization contracted to support municipalities with urban supervision. His duties were systematic and information-based. Verify the most recent satellite and aerial photography against official parcel charts to identify inconsistencies. In most instances, the discrepancies he discovered were ordinary: postponements in database updates, minor measurement mistakes, or standard renovations that had yet to be documented. That particular day, however, Harris discovered something significantly from ordinary. On a detailed satellite photograph captured just weeks before, he observed a property at the intersection of a peaceful residential road. It was not a typical residence. The photograph disclosed an enormous, three-level estate, complete with a covered pool, a tennis facility, designed gardens, and a substantial decorative water feature. The property was surrounded by a high, continuous barrier and occupied nearly 1 hectare of ground. Established trees provided shade around the boundary, and the grass displayed obvious signs of regular care. The setting indicated extended habitation, not recent building. Nevertheless, according to the official county property chart, the parcel was recorded as unoccupied. Harris initiated his confirmation procedure. Initially, he examined the parcel's historical documentation in the public property assessor system. The final recorded enhancement dated to the early 1990s, a humble, single-level residence constructed in 1968. There existed no documentation of destruction, no authorization requests for new building, and no examinations recorded in county records. The property's assessable worth had been determined for decades as if it remained an undeveloped parcel with an obsolete small residence. He examined aerial photography records covering 1995 to 2020. The irregularity intensified. Every photograph from the mid-1990s forward displayed the identical large estate in position, unaltered in size. That indicated the building had existed for over 25 years without ever being recognized in county documentation. Harris proceeded to taxation payment documentation. Annual property taxes were being settled consistently, but not by a person. The contributor was a Florida-registered LLC with an unremarkable standard name. In its annual submissions, the LLC indicated ownership by a Delaware business, which subsequently was managed by an international entity registered in the British Virgin Islands. For a specialist familiar with identifying patterns, the multiple corporate structure was an immediate warning signal. Such configurations were typical for asset protection and valuable real estate deals, but they were also a characteristic of plans intended to hide ownership, avoid taxes, or clean funds. In Miami's luxury property market, shell businesses were not uncommon, but even then, the physical buildings were typically documented in the property records. Here, there was an active attempt, it appeared, to render the structure itself undetectable to official information. Harris eliminated a mapping error by requesting a property survey comparison from the mapping department. The difference was complete. On documentation, an empty parcel. In actuality, a completely developed property with utility connections clearly apparent in the photography. The existence of electrical lines, water service, and waste connections suggested established arrangements with utility companies. Yet none of those services had initiated updates to property documentation. Typically, such a finding would be transferred directly to the municipal planning department for examination. This situation, however, was significantly from typical. Harris compiled a thorough report that contained satellite photographs covering decades, taxation payment histories, and a chart of the ownership structure from Florida to the Caribbean. His managers examined it and, understanding its potential legal consequences, avoided standard procedures. The documentation was transmitted directly to the Miami-Dade Property Assessor's Investigation Department. Within 48 hours, response verified Harris's concerns. The property was missing from all official building and improvement documentation. Its assessable worth had never been modified to reflect the estate, creating decades of substantial underpayment. The lack of permits indicated either intentional hiding or a deliberate exploitation of administrative weaknesses. The property assessor's office transferred the issue to the Miami Police Department's Financial Crimes Division. Investigators there immediately recognized the indicators of intentional hiding. The combination of a concealed building, corporate structuring across multiple jurisdictions, and continuous habitation suggested something beyond simple tax avoidance. Investigators started by following the taxation payment connection. All invoices were paid by the Florida LLC using a business bank account established under the name of a representative director. Utility accounts, electricity, water, gas, were also under the LLC's name. Payments were consistent, accurate, and lacking personal identifiers that could connect them to a person. Concurrently, forensic specialists started examining historical financial crime investigations involving real estate. The purpose was to locate any occurrence where similar business structures had been utilized in relation with fraud. Normally, such cross-examination would demand weeks of database searches, but an early connection appeared almost immediately. One experienced analyst observed that payment movements into the LLC's accounts during the mid-1990s reflected deposits and transactions documented in an unresolved 1990 Miami land fraud investigation. The amounts matched in value, time periods, and even in the sequence of following withdrawals to international accounts. That 1990 investigation involved a married couple who had cheated investors out of $2 million in fictitious land transactions before vanishing completely. Their identities, Terrence and Yvette Johnson. The investigation had been terminated in 1992, designated inactive after all connections were depleted. The similarity in financial activity was persuasive, though not yet conclusive. Still, it warranted a more thorough financial examination. The state attorney's office approved the hiring of a forensic accountant under agreement, along with an internal prosecutorial investigator, to analyze the money connection in detail. Their objective was evident: establish whether the capital used to obtain and sustain the Palmetto Bay property could be connected directly to the taken money from 1990. For Jamal Harris, the finding concluded with the report delivery. For the investigators now assuming control, it was merely the start. The documentation on the Johnson investigation had remained untouched in the Miami Police Department records for almost 3 decades. But in early 2021, the container was transported upstairs and positioned on the desk of investigators in the Financial Crimes Division. What motivated its return was not a random choice, but a direct connection, a property in Palmetto Bay, whose ownership arrangement and payment history reflected transactions from the early 1990s. The initial step was to retrieve the original financial paperwork assembled between 1990 and 1992. Within were comprehensive bank records from the Johnsons' real estate business, copies of wire transaction orders, and summaries of deposits and withdrawals from accounts that no longer operated. During the early 90s, following international capital had been a slow, unreliable procedure. Requests to foreign banks were transmitted by fax or postal service. Responses, if they arrived at all, came months later, and some regions ignored them completely. International secrecy regulations had protected owners behind numbered accounts and shell businesses. In 2021, those restrictions had disappeared. Progress in financial forensics indicated that decades-old paper documentation could be digitized, cross-examined, and processed through analytical software capable of recognizing patterns undetectable to human examination. Investigators digitized the 1990s records into a forensic accounting system, marking every transaction above a specific amount. Within days, the system generated a correlation. Multiple wire transactions in the Johnson documentation used the identical intermediary banks, the identical amounts, and on the identical dates as payments recorded in the ownership history of the Palmetto Bay property. This relationship didn't establish ownership, but it created a vital connection. One organization in the current property structure, a British Virgin Islands international company, had been mentioned in background materials from the 1990 land fraud investigation. That alone warranted reopening the examination completely. The state attorney's office approved an extended investigation. They hired a contracted forensic accountant with expertise in resolving complex international transactions, collaborating with an internal investigator from the prosecutor's office who focused on cold investigations involving real estate. Their goal was evident: reconstruct the movement of capital from the international accounts to the Florida property and identify the persons behind them. The team started charting the series of movements. In 1990, the Johnsons gathered approximately $2 million from investors through their fraudulent land transactions. Those capital were quickly moved to multiple international accounts. In 1993, a portion of the money returned to the United States disguised as foreign investment capital from the BVY registered business. That capital was channeled into a Florida LLC, which utilized it to acquire the Palmetto Bay parcel. By 1995, building of the property was beginning. From that moment forward, every property taxation payment and utility invoice was handled by business accounts, with no personal names included. While the accountants followed the money, the investigation team contacted the Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles. Anyone residing in the residence over the years might have utilized the address for driver's license updates, vehicle registrations, or insurance documentation. The inquiry returned a crucial outcome. In 2018, a woman named Shanice Williams had updated her driver's license indicating the Palmetto Bay address. A comparison of her DMV photograph to archived photographs of Yvette Johnson showed a remarkable correlation. Facial bone structure, eyebrow shape, and the positioning of the eyes were almost identical. Additional investigations revealed another identity connected to the property. From the early 2000s until 2015, a man named Marcus Williams had utilized the same address in DMV and insurance documentation. His photograph showed an equally strong similarity to Terrence Johnson, aged by years and graying at the hair. The correlation was too accurate to dismiss as chance. The investigators then obtained State Department of Health documentation, verifying that Marcus Williams, actual name Terrence Johnson, had died in 2015 of natural causes. The death certificate contained only the assumed identity, which explained why no law enforcement notifications had been activated at the time. Yvette, however, remained living. DMV records indicated she had updated her driver's license in 2018 with the same Palmetto Bay address, locating her in the residence well into the current decade. This focused the investigation's attention. She was the probable surviving proprietor and possibly the final connection to the taken capital. To strengthen their investigation, the forensic accountant examined decades of bank activity. The objective was to locate documentation demonstrating that the capital used to purchase the parcel and construct the property came directly from accounts identified in the 1990 fraud parallel inquiries were sent to utility companies. Billing histories for electricity, water, and natural gas verified continuous habitation of the residents from the mid-1990s to the present. All invoiced to the Florida LLC payments were taken from a single business account, yet another sign of intentional hiding. Before the team could quietly proceed to the following step, news of the investigation became public. The Miami Herald published an article about the invisible estate of Palmetto Bay, mentioning that it might be related to one of the city's largest unresolved fraud investigations. The story circulated rapidly through local media and online platforms, generating tips from anonymous sources. Some claimed to have known the Johnsons personally in the 1980s and early 1990s, describing them as expert at transferring money internationally and establishing impenetrable business structures long before their disappearance. For investigators, the publicity was beneficial and problematic. The flow of tips provided new connections and background details, but the media attention risked informing Yvette that law enforcement was approaching. In reaction, the prosecutor's office expedited preparations for a search authorization, determined to act before any evidence could be eliminated or relocated. By this point, the investigation documentation contained a series of persuasive components: verified identities of both Johnsons under false names, photographic correlations from DMV documentation, a reconstructed financial connection linking international accounts to the property, consistent utility documentation proving extended habitation, and transactional similarities with the original fraud investigation. Each component supported the theory that the Palmetto Bay property had been purchased and sustained with taken investor money. The investigation was no longer about a questionable residence. It was about the return of fugitives believed to have disappeared 3 decades earlier. The following step was evident: obtain legal permission to enter the property and search for physical evidence connecting it directly to the proceeds of the 1990 scheme. The opportunity window was closing, and the investigation team understood they had to act before it shut completely. By the time the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office proceeded to obtain a federal search authorization for the estate in Palmetto Bay, the investigation had already changed from a disconnected examination of questionable real estate into a direct mission to expose 2 fugitives who had avoided the law for over 30 years. The evidence connection was no longer a scattered collection of irregularities. It was an organized sequence that investigators could follow from the fraud in 1990 directly to the current-day property. At its foundation was a Florida-registered LLC that legally possessed the title to the ground. Above it existed a Delaware business, and beyond that, an international organization in the British Virgin Islands. This stratification of ownership had been a typical strategy in the early 1990s for hiding the actual identity of asset possessors, and the names of these organizations were already recorded in the original Johnson investigation documentation from decades earlier. The forensic accountant hired under agreement by the state attorney's office had spent weeks examining through archival bank documentation, reconstructing the transfer of capital with a precision level that had been impossible in the 1990s. He correlated historical payment records from the original fraud to bank transaction records preserved in institutional files, discovering undeniable similarities. The money that funded the LLC's acquisition of the Palmetto Bay parcel had originated directly from the identical international account that received investor payments during the Johnson's land scheme. The relationship extended beyond general patterns. Specific transaction values and precise dates aligned perfectly, in some instances down to the day, leaving minimal possibility for chance. While the accountant followed the money, the state attorney's investigator was confirming habitation patterns through DMV documentation and utility histories. The discoveries were consistent. The estate had been continuously inhabited since the mid-1990s, with electricity, water, and gas invoices all paid from the identical business accounts connected to the LLC. Payment documentation showed no interruptions or irregularities, eliminating the possibility that the residence was vacant, abandoned, or merely a paper holding. The actual advancement occurred when archived DMV entries from 2018 disclosed that a woman named Shanice Williams had utilized the estate's address. Her driver's license photograph, when compared to archived photographs of Yvette Johnson from the early 1990s, showed an unmistakable correlation: the identical facial bone structure, matching eye shapes, and a subtle elevation of the right eyebrow, a characteristic visible in the older photographs as well. A more thorough examination into DMV history demonstrated that prior to 2015, the same address had been connected to a man named Marcus Williams. His license photograph, aged by decades, displayed the identical bone structure, build, and facial characteristics as Terrence Johnson. His hair had become gray and his face had aged, but the similarity was undeniable. Verification from the Department of Health confirmed that Marcus Williams had died in 2015 of natural causes, with the death certificate containing only the assumed identity. This explained why Terrence Johnson's fugitive status had not connected with any official death documentation. With Terrence deceased, the evidence indicated Yvette living under her false identity as the sole resident and continuing recipient of the holdings the couple had obtained through fraud. The prosecutorial team assembled every component they possessed into a comprehensive investigation file. Photographic evidence from DMV records confirmed the actual identities of both persons. Banking documentation mapped the direct movement of illegal capital from the original scheme into the property acquisition. Business filings recorded the ownership structure. Utility payment histories verified extended residence. Combined, these created a complete, logical narrative connecting the 1990 crime to the present-day estate. The federal judge examining the warrant request recognized the combined significance of financial documentation, identity correlations, and continuous habitation, and approved the search. The strategy was implemented with accuracy. At sunrise, law enforcement quietly secured the surrounding roads. The search team, consisting of state attorney investigators, financial crimes detectives, and forensic specialists, entered the property with the warrant ready. Inside, Yvette was located in the main room. She was notified of the legal procedure and placed under supervision while the search began. Investigators proceeded systematically through the residence, photographing each area and recording the position of any physical evidence. On the upper floor, in a private study, they opened a locked wooden desk. Inside were systematically arranged files, property deeds, taxation records, and correspondence related to the Palmetto Bay parcel. Many of the papers dated to the mid-1990s, exactly when the property was obtained and the estate built. In the lower level, the team found a heavy metal safe with a combination mechanism. Once opened, it contained bundles of U.S. currency still covered in original bank bands. The serial number sequences printed on the bands matched documentation from the 1990 fraud examination, establishing beyond question that the currency was part of the taken investor capital. Along with the money were multiple external storage devices and older portable computers. Forensic analysis on location verified the existence of digitized fraudulent land documents and property maps identical to those utilized by the Johnsons in their original scheme. These findings raised the investigation from a circumstantial connection to undeniable evidence. The physical currency directly connected the property to the proceeds of the 1990 fraud, and the digital records preserved the operational instruments of the original scheme. For prosecutors, this meant the capability to charge Yvette not only with money cleaning and tax avoidance, but also to reopen the decades-old fraud investigation under the continuing crime principle, effectively avoiding the statute of limitations. By the completion of the operation, every piece of evidence was documented and removed under strict custody procedures. The team departed the property knowing they now possessed a complete and solid foundation for arrest and prosecution. What remained unknown was whether Yvette, given her history of disappearing without evidence, would still be accessible when they proceeded to take her into custody. The search within the Palmetto Bay estate represented a crucial turning point in the examination. The papers retrieved from locked storage and the aged bank bands pulled from the safe accomplished more than establish a relationship between the property and the taken capital. They provided a structure to reconstruct the mechanics of the original fraud almost month by month. Every file, receipt, and transfer documentation became a puzzle component in a decades-long scheme that had been concealed in plain view. The forensic accountant contracted by the prosecutor's office started his work in coordination with the Financial Crimes Analysis Division. The initial emphasis was to align the transactions recorded in the physical folders and on the recovered storage devices with archived banking records from the early 1990s. The correlations were remarkable. In July of 1990, within days of the Johnsons' disappearance from Miami, the account belonging to their shell business initiated a series of large transfers to an international institution in Nassau. The values and dates aligned exactly with marked transfers from the original investigation file, which had remained dormant in the police records for almost 30 years. These international deposits remained undisturbed until late 1992, when the capital were quietly returned to the United States, disguised as foreign investment into what was described in documentation as a private residential construction. Those returning capital landed directly in the account of a Florida-registered LLC managed by a representative owner. Within a month, that LLC completed the acquisition of the Palmetto Bay parcel, a valuable piece of real estate that was officially categorized at the time as undeveloped ground. There were no construction permits associated with the property, no modification requests, and no examinations documented in county files. Yet the building documentation found in the estate revealed that by early 1995, work teams were on location, laying foundations and constructing the main structure of a 3-level residence complete with luxury features. The building itself had been structured with hiding. The work was performed by a series of subcontractors, many of whom had been employed through another intermediary business, itself a paper organization designed to hide the identity of the actual customer. Payments were directed through multiple accounts, with each level intended to separate the documentation connection from the Johnsons' taken capital. Any contractor who might have raised questions saw only the name of a legitimate Florida LLC on their payments, never the persons behind it. One of the most successful components in concealing ownership was the utilization of a Florida land trust created under Statute 689.071. In such trusts, the trustee's identity appears on the property title, while the actual beneficiary's identity is protected from public documentation. The trustee in this instance was a representative figure, a local individual who, for a fixed annual payment, signed all papers without investigation into their contents. His participation kept the Johnsons' identities, or any of their known false names, distant from any registry that an investigator in the 1990s could have examined. The utility invoices discovered during the search provided a continuous sequence of habitation. Electric, water, and gas services had been invoiced to the identical LLC from the day of connection, and all payments were made from a single business account at a Florida bank. The consistency of these payments, never delayed, never interrupted, supported the conclusion that the residence had been continuously inhabited, even as it remained officially non-existent in taxation and property systems. Because property taxes were calculated only on the ground value, determined as if the parcel were still a bare plot, the annual responsibility remained a fraction of what it should have been. Over the period of more than 2 decades, this resulted in hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid taxes, savings that were, in actuality, part of the ongoing fraud. As the prosecutor's team applied these discoveries onto a comprehensive timeline, the story became solid. In 1990, $2 million were taken from investors through the transaction of non-existent land parcels. The capital were quickly moved internationally, processed through jurisdictions to eliminate their source, and then returned under the appearance of legitimate investment. The Palmetto Bay property was obtained and constructed without the county ever recording the new building. The residence existed, lived in, and maintained, but undetectable to the systems designed to document and regulate such holdings. Any excess from the original taken capital had been directed into additional enterprises, themselves concealed by similar shell organizations, establishing a network of holdings that could function indefinitely beyond the scope of standard supervision. For investigators, this reconstructed sequence of events was more than a historical record. It was a legal connection, because the taken money had been actively cleaned and reinvested well beyond the 1990s. The criminal behavior could be characterized as an ongoing crime. This classification was essential, as it avoided the statute of limitations that would otherwise have prevented prosecution for the original fraud. Now the charges could be expanded to include money cleaning, electronic fraud, tax avoidance, and conspiracy, all supported by fresh evidence that connected the actions directly to holdings still in the defendant's control. After the search of the Palmetto Bay estate concluded and the forensic analysis of the evidence was complete, the Miami-Dade prosecutor's office proceeded quickly to establish charges. The indictment they prepared utilized three primary criminal counts: extensive fraud, money cleaning, and tax avoidance. Every element of the investigation had been systematically constructed over months of examination, from the digital connections and business documentation to the physical currency bands recovered from the safe. The story the prosecutors presented to the federal grand jury was thorough, connecting old evidence with the newly discovered proof in a way that left minimal possibility for alternative interpretations. Jurors were shown the transaction histories following the taken capital across decades, the photographic correlations from DMV records verifying identity changes, and the documentation establishing continuous habitation of the concealed estate. The grand jury's choice was rapid. With the custody sequence intact and verification from multiple sources, they voted unanimously to approve a federal arrest warrant for Yvette Johnson, who had been living under the identity Shanice Williams. Once the warrant was produced, the operation to take her into custody was planned for a Tuesday morning, early in the day, to minimize the chances of her being absent and to ensure the tactical team could secure the property before information circulated. When the convoy arrived and the boundary was established, the quietness of the property was the initial indication that something was incorrect. The window coverings were closed, the driveway unoccupied, and there were no indications of activity inside. The team entered the front entrance, proceeding through the familiar areas documented during the search weeks earlier, but each one was empty. Closets were partially cleared, and storage that had once been neatly arranged now contained only scattered items. The kitchen surfaces were empty. It became evident within minutes that Yvette had departed. Neighbors contacted discreetly for information remembered seeing her 2 days earlier placing several large bags into a black vehicle. Flight documentation verified the next component. Under her assumed identity, a reservation had been purchased to Panama City the same afternoon. Panama's location as a gateway to much of Central and South America indicated she could have proceeded within hours to a jurisdiction where U.S. law enforcement would have minimal practical authority. The search of her residence weeks earlier had already indicated that the examination was active and approaching. Whether she had been informed about an imminent arrest through a contact or had simply interpreted the signs from the intensive nature of the search, she understood that remaining meant risking immediate detention. For someone with decades of experience in avoiding law enforcement, the choice to disappear again was almost natural. The property itself was immediately confiscated under civil seizure laws as a holding obtained with criminal proceeds. The legal procedure proceeded faster than the criminal trial would have, resulting in the estate's auction listing within months. Purchasers came from across Florida, attracted by both the location and the publicity of the investigation. When the transaction concluded, the proceeds were directed into a compensation fund for surviving victims of the 1990 scheme. Although the amount recovered was considerable, it covered only a portion of the original losses. Much of the taken fortune remained secured in international accounts registered to organizations still beyond the scope of American legal orders, their management now likely transferred to intermediaries or hidden within new ownership structures. Within the prosecutor's office, the investigation was recorded as both a success and a warning story. It demonstrated the capability of modern investigative instruments, satellite photography, utility invoice analysis, financial forensics, cross-referenced identification systems, to penetrate through decades of hiding. Yet it also demonstrated that even solid evidence could not guarantee a suspect's presence at the moment of arrest. For the victims, the resolution was mixed. Many of those who had been cheated 3 decades earlier were no longer alive to witness the outcome. Those who remained received partial compensation, but were keenly aware that the woman responsible had once again avoided direct responsibility. Officially, the documentation could be closed once the property was sold and the compensation distributed, but the absence of a defendant in the courtroom left the conclusion feeling unfinished. As for Yvette Johnson, her location became the subject of conjecture. Intelligence reports suggested she might have traveled through multiple connection points after Panama, possibly changing her identity again and establishing residence in a location with restricted extradition agreements. In professional circles, the opinion was that she had the resources and connections to rebuild a comfortable existence elsewhere, perhaps in another luxurious property just as carefully protected from public documentation as the estate in Palmetto Bay.